Good afternoon, everyone. We will get this webinar underway if we've reached the top of the hour. So in the spirit of not wasting any time, we'll get going. So I will quickly introduce myself as the host and moderator for today. My name is Lauren Ledwell, and I've recently joined Discovery Garden. I don't know most of you who have attended today, so it's a pleasure to virtually meet you. I joined Discovery Garden about a month ago as VP Marketing and Strategic Business Development. And for future visibility, we hope to actually host webinars such as this, hopefully every month. And so if any of you are interested in key topics that you would like us to further dive into, feel free to reach out to me after the event. We have a good agenda today, and so we'll be talking about migrating to Islandora 8. We have two presenters. Stephen, I'll get you to move to the next page. Stephen Perkins, a solution architect and project manager with Discovery Garden. Some of you may have interacted with Stephen in the past. He's an amazing asset to our team, and we'll step through the bulk of the content today. And secondly, we have Jordan Dukart, he's a software architect and senior developer with Discovery Garden, and will help step through a very quick demo in a couple of minutes. So in terms of structure, we have 40 minutes of content, and then we would hope that you can use the chat and Q&A function in Zoom to please submit any questions that you have. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll have about 20 minutes, which is a good chunk of time to dive into questions, concerns, areas of further interest, and so on. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Lauren. Hi, everybody. Hi to the people I know, and pleased to meet you to those of you that are new. Now, some of you may already know about Discovery Garden, so this would be remedial to you. But for those of you that are new, Discovery Garden was founded in 2010, and it was an offshoot of the original Islandora project at UPEI. The foundation was established in 2013, and Discovery Garden has now done over 500 installations for over 200 clients. So a lot of extensive experience. The staff has a lot of combined experience in development, doing solution architecture, design, implementation, theming, and also the practice of building digital repositories and preservation storage itself. Currently, we're helping people to curate and keep custody and preserve over 100 million files. We're an active member of the foundation and make a lot of technical contribution to the project itself. Quite a significant amount of the code commits come from the great team of developers at DGI. And we do offer a full range of services, and we also have some exclusive Islandora-based products. We have a couple of editions now of Islandora 8. There's one for digital collections and one for institutional repositories. And both of those make use of a new AWS-backed Islandora 8 preservation storage architecture. Now, before we dive in, why would we want to move to Islandora 8? So I want to talk about the opportunities that it represents. The storage and metadata within Islandora are flexible. So the community edition allows you to use Fedora, but also implements something called Fly System, which means that we can set up preservation storage or local storage in other architectures as well. At Discovery Garden, we leverage that to create our AWS preservation layer. The metadata allows you to adapt your use of Islandora to your particular application profile. The interface I find, and generally most people do, to be much easier to use. It is significantly less, I would say, clunky. It's a more friendly user experience, and it also offers you greater autonomy. Jordan's going to speak in a moment to the ways that it reduces complexity and customization, but those features allow a lot more to be set by the clients in the administrative interface. So it divorces you a bit from dependency on either internal service providers or external service providers. And there is already a lot of support in the community. There are a tremendous number of early adopters of Islandora 8. There are a lot of people involved in the development. So there's a lot of action in the community. So getting involved gets you a lot of dance partners, so to speak. And I'm going to pass it over to Jordan to sort of talk from a developer perspective from the about the remaining points.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so like Stephen mentioned, it reduces complexity. So something that's, I don't want to say plagued Islandora in the old version, but something that was limiting was, we kind of used Drupal as more of a PHP framework than kind of fully leveraging or fully utilizing all the features that Drupal kind of provides. So with going to Drupal 8, Islandora kind of redefined how it models its data. And with that, we're able to leverage more and more Drupal community contributed modules. So like a good example for that is, say, in the 7 version of Islandora, we kind of wrote and maintained our own kind of Solar search integration, including like how the stuff gets indexed into Solar and, like transforming XML to be Solar fields and so on and so forth, where, in the new version in Drupal 8, there's a community module that already does all that for us. So it's less code that we have to like customize and maintain, and it like really kind of reduces, the complexity for setting up an install or just even to get going from doing some custom development. Like Steven said, it also kind of reduces the customization. So, from a developer perspective, Drupal's design decisions in 8 has made it a lot easier for you to write custom pieces of code that might really kind of alter the underlying architecture of what you might think Drupal is, but it's not going to make you drift away from, say, using core Islandora or core Drupal, where Fly System is a pretty good example of that, where, all of a sudden you can start to leverage, S3, or you can even use Dropbox or any kind of external service as what, Drupal's going to go right to, which really kind of opens the doors for, things you can do here. On top of that, one of the big community pushes was for linked open data. So Islandora 8 does provide a JSON-LD endpoint where you can kind of retrieve any Islandora object in its JSON-LD format, which does kind of promote that linked open data growth. With that as well, you could write any kind of serializer you would want. So maybe you would want to go to some bespoke metadata format, or maybe you had a requirement for QDC or some other format. You can do that relatively easy. On top of that as well, we can talk about integration opportunities. So in the old version of the software, we were kind of limited because we had to write any kind of, APIs or things like that in order to expose these objects. With 8, because we're very much conforming with Drupal, all this is already built for us out of the box in core Drupal. So one of the other projects that we're undertaking, or something that I've been, put on or been working on quite a bit, is being able to kind of look at doing a decoupled Drupal instance. So you still have, our Islandora 8 as your repository and your backend, and all your content is preserved, but maybe you want to render up your front end using, a JavaScript framework. You can totally do that and still be fully Drupal and fully Islandora. And that's just in core Drupal. And the last point on this is microservices. So Islandora is very much embracing kind of a, I don't want to say decoupled architecture, but a split out architecture, in a sense that out of the box, your derivatives are going to be generated asynchronously, where before, unless you were utilizing, say, the Gearman work that discoverygarden had done, you're sitting there waiting for your derivatives to generate as you ingest objects.
Great, thanks, Jordan. And of course, we've managed to give you 10 points before we mentioned the ticking of the clock as I7 heads for end of life. So we're going to talk today about, these are some of the reasons that you might consider moving sooner, and then talk about what that transition would be. So we're going to spend more of our time having a procedural conversation about Islandora 8 transitions than in a low-level technical chat, though no doubt, we've already hit some technical points as we've gone, and we will as we move along. This isn't going to be visually flashy, but it is intended to support you in understanding how to plan and work through this process, hopefully reduce the stress that thinking about such a thing can create. I know it does me sometimes, even despite my position. And it'll tell you the ways that Discovery Garden is here to support you. And at the end, as Lauren mentioned, we'd like to give everybody an opportunity to share questions, thoughts, and any experience that you may already have. These are still somewhat early days, and we know that you'll have great questions and input. So what I want to do now is talk about essentials for a smooth transition. We're going to start high level, and then we'll drop slightly closer to survey the few key components of these technology transitions. The first one is that projects are not normal operations. They begin, they execute, and they end. Careful planning doesn't always make for perfect outcomes, but it sure increases the chances of excellent ones. Secondly, having everybody on board is vital in your organization or whatever type of unit that you're working within managing your repository, as is having all of those people aware of what their part's going to be. Be able to make a case for your drivers for migrating and the return on investment that's going to bring you to anybody. I kind of use this methodology when I'm looking at a stock to buy, right? So always be able to make your case to somebody. What's the value that we want out of this? And it keeps you focused. Now, also know where you're going. So spend a little time diving into Islandora 8. Scratch that, spend a lot of time diving into Islandora 8. There are a lot of resources available for that. We're going to give you a slide at the end of the deck that you can look, but the foundation has a YouTube channel with tons of tutorials. There's a sandbox, there's a Google group. There's just, as I said previously, a really broad and active community out there. Next thing you should know is, what do I need when I get there? Know what features you absolutely must have parity with or a close equivalent to, and when you need them, because phased implementations are a good idea. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later. And also know what you can live without, even if it's just initially. Next up, what are you bringing with you? And how are you going to serve it to people? How much content do you have? How much do you plan on growing your repository? What are all the ways that you serve your content? All these things you need to know to do your project planning. Now, you're going to need a migration process that is robust, meaning it correctly handles all of the structures and permutations of your content and has 100% fidelity. And it also needs to be repeatable, as I can guarantee you that you're going to iterate at least once. And actually, if you have to iterate just once, you are extremely fortunate. So wrap your arms around that one now. So I want to go through that breakdown that I talked about. 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. We're going to talk about the platform setup, feature setup, and content migration. Now, what I mean by features setup in number 2 is the actual functional pieces of the software that various users in different roles interact with your content with. Now, for the platform setup, we talked about in the previous slide, surveying your content and creating a manifest. So I want you to create an inventory of everything that you have in your current collection. It's great. I need to know, how many collections I have, what types of objects I have, and also survey anything that you want to use in an additive sense, because don't forget, migrations present an opportunity to get even more content in. Maybe you don't have everything in Islandora 7 yet, but you want to swoop in some new content while you're making this migration that you have sitting around on hard drives or other legacy systems, wherever it is. Gather your non-functional requirements. How much disk space do I need? What requirements do I have in the way of preservation? Do I need redundant storage? Do I need geographic cross-replication? Does my organization, have specific requirements we need to meet? You need to know this. What is the amount of CPU throughput that I need? So this can be really simple if you're a small institution, or complex if you're a big one. If you're involved in a big digitization project, you need to know about what your ingest throughput is going to be. You may need to put some architecture in place that isolates end users from the impact of that. So how many searches, how many normal web users you have, how many catalogers you have, what your digitization throughput would be. All of these things have to do with the amount of traffic load that we need to deal with. Also, the number of environments. So again, for smaller organizations, this may be one thing. We have one environment, we have our production site, that's it. But in a more complex organization, you may have a production environment, an ingest environment, a development environment, and a staging environment where you preview new releases. So you need that information. Now, once you have all of these things, you can provision, the next step is to provision the infrastructure and install Islandora 8, or you can also just sign up for an Islandora 8 software as a service product, also available to you. I want to talk about some missteps that you will want to avoid in this step. First thing, all technology transitions involve concurrently running the new platform and the legacy platform for a period of time. Setting the sunset date of your Islandora 7 system, and that I mean when you pull the switch on it to turn it off, by any other criteria than when your new platform is go live ready is asking for trouble. This is really something you need to back time, not seat of pants. Secondly, remember any services that are external to Islandora may also need to be migrated. So a good example of this is if you're using a service to mint identifiers such as handles. Well, that's not a part of really it is integrated with your Islandora 7, but it's a separate thing, and you're going to need to update the handle resolutions, and you're going to need to make sure that you have that service connected in your new i8 platform. Lastly, poor cutover planning is a big misstep. At go live, a lot of things need to be coordinated. For example, you need to set up when you're going to suspend active content changes or ingest, get your DNS cut over. You're going to need to be complete with your Islandora 8 user acceptance testing. So I encourage you to be thorough and exhaustive in your considerations and planning. The next big step is going to be the setup of your functional features. So at the beginning, I covered knowing what features you absolutely must have, when you need them, and what you can live without with, even if it's just at the start. So there's very few technology transitions that involve 100% feature parity. And so some flexibility is sometimes required in adopting slightly different ways of doing the same thing. Now, there's a couple of ways to seed this process. One is to walk through your user journeys in every role that your current i7 system user base has. So walk through as an end user, walk through as a cataloger, walk through as a repository administrator, whatever roles you have, and document the features that you use, but also document what you don't use so you know what you don't need. And next, I would make a list of all the Drupal and Islandora modules you employ. It's helpful if you're specific enough in that list to say, well, we have this module, it's got 6 features, we only use these 2. Again, making note of what it is that's absolutely essential to you. So the next step, once you document the functional features that you require, is to create what we call a parity mapping and also an additive feature list. So mapping feature parity means to evaluate what functional features you do or don't use in your current instance, any integrations with external tools that it has, and then map how to achieve those same outcomes in Islandora 8. Now, sometimes this is really direct, and sometimes you take up a new way of doing things. Same feature, just a different method. So for example, controlling metadata displays is done somewhat differently in i8, but mentally it's kind of a straightforward thing to look at. There's a configuration tool and you tell it what to display and how. So that's a straightforward thing to get your head around. Whereas access to repository items can potentially be controlled in several different ways, and there's no direct equivalent to the policy editor. So there's some different things to get your head around. Include in your mapping the permissions that you need for each feature, meaning make sure you note which roles will be allowed to use them. If you need a handy way to prioritize things, I use something called Moscow. And that just means that you label everything with must, should, could, won't. And the W is that category that you place anything that you don't need. So I'm gonna actually just toggle over to a mapping that I have to show you what this might look like. Now, back when the foundation released Islandora, we were faced with the task of like, okay, this is maybe June 2019. What does it have? What do we need to successfully do implementations for our clients, and how are we going to do that? So you'll see I busted things into a class. What do I need for access control, content management? Now, I'm happy to report to you that this is very old, and the majority of the features that I was mapping here are now in the system. But at that point in time, it was quite a job to map this parity and say, okay, well, we're going to need single sign-on. Do we need to support easy project proxy? We'll need to do embargo. And then I set priorities for those and when this might be available from the community, because that's another good thing to know. I'll talk about why it's a reason to prioritize things is that you might benefit from waiting a little bit sometimes. I'm going to cover that in just a little bit later on. Now, oh, sorry, this stepped ahead of slide for me. So your migration is hopefully going to capitalize on some new capabilities that are available to you in Islandora 8 as well. So if you know of anything, so you go and spend some time in Islandora 8, you see something new that you want, write that down too. That's what I consider your additive feature list. I want this new stuff. And the reason it's important to know about all of the features you desire in advance of the data migration process is that the data has to support them, right? You can't do them unless the metadata is there. So the missteps that you can avoid in this second phase or second part of this process is solutionizing too much too early. So think essential when you set up that target feature set. And remember that Islandora 8, while it's production ready now, is still rapidly evolving. High demand features are going to be prioritized by the community, and your voice counts. So sometimes a little bit of patience can pay off. Remember also that until users are actually immersed in a new experience and understand it thoroughly, expectations can be somewhat theoretical or bound to the experience that they're used to. So once they're happy in the new Islandora 8 world, their thinking frees up, and sometimes a new, better solution for achieving the same impact comes up. Doing too much too soon puts the old boundaries in place, and that can have a cost impact. The next component in a transition is going to be the data migration. And to migrate successfully, you're going to need to know how your data is structured, i.e. what schema does it use? In i7, that's usually mods, but maybe you use DC and maybe you have some other bespoke elements. But you're going to need to have a profile of that. So you need to know how your data specifically uses those elements within those particular schema. So we refer to this as a metadata application profile or a map. And having up-to-date documentation of your map is super helpful. But if you lack that, there are programmatic methods to report on this, although sometimes there are surprising results. You'll need an indexing profile. It's also important to verify the ways you want users to be able to query your information within Islandora 8. After a little time in Islandora 8 or having a lot of time under your belt with your data in Islandora 7, you may have some new ideas about how you want to index and display information. This is a good time to jot those down so that you can consider them and get them in your configurations. Now, this third item, data mapping, is just that. You're going to map the various metadata components that we got from our first step. Whether they're descriptive or administrative or relational, you're going to map that to the Islandora 8 content, both what we call repository items, which is kind of the Islandora 8 equivalent of i7 objects, and taxonomies. Taxonomies are leveraged extensively in Islandora 8, and it's a wonderful thing. Now, with all of the above in hand, we're going to move on to the next thing, which is if the default Islandora 8 content type doesn't suit, it doesn't align perfectly with your map, chances are that's the case. You'll have to make some degree of adjustments. Configuration changes can be made to set up a perfect target for the mapping. So now we've got our source and we've got our target, and we can start to put together a migration. Now, I have an optional item next called interventions. It's rare that the outcomes of the data survey are perfect, as I alluded to earlier, and that's completely okay. Migrations offer the option to perform interventions to improve and enrich your data, or at the very least document any issues that you want to address once you do migrate to I8, because Islandora 8 offers a lot of different ways to improve the quality of your repository items and enhance the experience that the users have interacting with them. Now, missteps that you can avoid. Don't assume your data is perfect. It's not. That's one of the first conversations I generally have with the projects that I take up to implement. Let's look at the data. I'm going to find things. You may or may not like them. And that's fine. We can address them, but you need to, there can be a time cost if you don't allow for that. You're also going to need to allow enough time for review and iterations and to perform any interventions that you have. All of these things that I'm going through are things that you want to back time into your timeline for migration. So once all seeding is complete, we move to the actual work of the data migration itself. And here's where Jordan can do a much better job than I explaining the process. He's going to review how Discovery Garden approaches the process and review some of the available strategies.
Thanks, Stephen. Yep, so this is kind of outlining the currently available migration tools. I will say that Drupal Migrate is definitely the most widely adopted framework so far, primarily because it is a core Drupal module, so it ships with Drupal core. It's historically what's been used to, say, migrate content from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 and from 7 to 8. But given that it is extensible, you can write your own migrations, which is kind of what's been done with the Claw, the Islandora community as a whole, and kind of what we've done at DGI for our approach. Some of the benefits you do get just out of the box is this idea of high watermarking. So in short, that lets you iteratively rerun your migration, and only things that have changed will be updated. So, if you do initial migration and you ingest, say, 500 objects, and you export your source data again, and maybe you've updated fields on 5 of them, only those 5 objects will get reran. On top of that, it does also support rollbacks. So, if that 500 object migration failed or acted in some way that you didn't expect, you can always roll that back to kind of the previous version of the object that was there. So Migrate Claw 7x is an Islandora community module. It's what the foundation has worked on, and it's pretty much intended as a starting point in the sense that it gives you a proof of concept and shows you how you can go about kind of modifying or writing your own plugins to suit your needs. It's definitely not intended to be an end-to-end approach for everyone. It's like with how data is modeled and how everything else can differ per repository. It's kind of tough to do this as a one-size-fits-all. And Stephen kind of talked about earlier how getting your voice out there in the community will help dictate the future feature set. Very recently, which some of you are probably aware of, the Islandora Foundation put out their kind of community survey as to what the next driven features are going to be. And if you want further information or more in-depth information on that, it's posted on their website. But in terms of like iteration on the Migrate Claw approach, they're going to try to document it a little bit better, but there's not going to be a whole lot of change or a whole lot of improvements coming to it in the near future. It's pretty far down on their list of priorities. So beyond using Drupal Migrate and Migrate Claw, there is an additional option which you could undertake if you were a smaller repository. And just to take a step back, I will say that obviously, your content and factors around your content like size or how many objects and things like that will dictate like how you would approach a migration. So you could do something bespoke, like, export all your data, map it to a CSV, and then ingest it that way. Obviously, you're going to be missing some things that you could potentially benefit from if you want another approach. Like, it'd be really hard to undertake something like that and maintain, say, your audit trail or your version history. Whereas if you did something like, DGI's migration approach, you can preserve all that. So yeah, moving on to the next slide, Stephen. This is just kind of a diagram defining the migration workflow for, our migration approach, but this kind of applies to just Drupal Migrate in general, in the sense that, you're initially extracting your data out of your old system. So for us, we're exporting the Fedora object XML, which we use as kind of our basis for moving forward. From that, you can kind of parse all that data and create your map. Stephen is an Oxygen wizard. He can go through and kind of extract all the unique elements and get lovely counts, but obviously it's kind of up to how you want to do it. But you use that map to build your migration definition. And this is the step where you are writing some Drupal code that denotes, like, my mod's title field is going to go to a title field in Drupal. So the ins and outs of just mapping your stuff into the form that Drupal expects. After that point, you run the migration, and obviously you review the migration. The dotted arrows kind of denote stages where you can kind of jump around. So when we talked about like high watermarking or the iterative rerun, obviously if you built your map and built definition and you ran the migration once and you want to extract your data again, you can skip all those other steps. Similarly, if you were reviewing your migration and you didn't like the outcome, you could roll back to prior to when it was ran. So at this point, Stephen's going to go to the next slide, which just has a little quick pre-recorded demo, which might be similar to Islandora Online. So hopefully you guys see something new. Not getting audio, Stephen.
I'm sorry, did you say the audio was not playing?
Correct. I'm going to quickly demo off our Islandora 7 to Islandora 8 migration tool. We're going to take a pretty simple sample collection from Islandora 7 and move it into a completely fresh Islandora 8 install. So this collection is just a collection of basic images containing furry companions of people who work at DGI. So these objects are pretty stub in nature, where they're just basic images with a description and a title and a subject of dogs. So our 8 site has no content in it right now beyond a couple nodes for like the front page search content and the about page. So how we're going to trigger this is with Drupal migrate with a drush command. So I'm just going to quickly trigger this off and let it run. So while this runs, I'll say this is a pretty high-level overview, and if you want more kind of technical depth or a more in-depth look into what's happening behind the scenes here, I'd suggest checking out the presentation we gave at Islandora Online, and the link for that will be in the resource portion of the slide deck at the end. So while this runs, it's creating, the media, the files, and what's classified as Islandora objects in the new Islandora 8 system. One other thing to note is once this is all complete, the derivatives themselves will still need to be triggered. So while the migration itself will be done, the derivatives are being processed in the background, which is kind of the Islandora 8 default approach for handling derivatives. So this is just about finished up here, and then we'll go have a look at the content in our Drupal site. So if I refresh this page now, you see that we have all of the objects that we went to migrate. So we kind of have our top level collection, which we brought across, and the sub collection and all the children. So I'm going to click on this object here and hope that its derivatives are complete. So what you'll see here when we look at it is that it does have some pretty sparse metadata that, like I said, it had a description as part of that collection, and you can see that we've brought across our lovely dogs. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back off to Stephen, and he's going to continue on with the presentation.
Thanks. All right. So before we get to discussion, I just want to cover some risk and cost mitigation. Like I said earlier, plan, allocate, adequate time and resources to get this done. Get everybody on board, rally the troops, and don't be late to the party. Start hitting some of the resources that we give you. Play with Islandora 8. I really enjoy it myself. It's a great user experience and a really versatile tool. I like the freedom that it's given me with implementations, particularly being able to dodge customizations and really creatively employ the community modules that are available for Drupal. Keep in mind what's important and what's not that important. Get in there and participate in the community. And then, lean on Discovery Garden as much as you need to or not. We can do transition consulting and planning for you, all phases of the transition, platform feature and data migration. Tech transitions are known to be challenging. That's just a fact. So proper planning makes the best use of your funding, your human resources, your outside service providers, and that's going to reduce your risk. And I urge you to get in the game early with all of your stakeholders. My experience is that stragglers are potentially spared the early implementer finger pricks, but they often run afoul of the clock and their sponsors. And most importantly, they don't reap the rewards of the platform advantages that are offered. So now with that, we'd like to open up the floor for some discussion. Please share any experience that you have. And really importantly, what, if any, blockers you feel you still have to making a transition to i8, and of course, just any general questions or concerns.
Thanks, Stephen. It's Lauren here. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to submit any questions or comments that they have. Stephen, we do have one question that came in from anonymous attendee saying, are you planning on using Drupal 8 as the backbone or Drupal 9?
Ooh, I can field that one, Stephen. So I believe the Islandora community's official stance, which was fairly recent, is they are committed to a certain date, which I can't recall top of my head. But the big barrier is the Islandora suite of modules depends on a collection of Drupal contrib modules, and not all of those modules right now are Drupal 9 compliant. However, I've done some research myself into going to Drupal 9. I'm a Drupal core contributor. I want to get us to Drupal 9. Like, it's definitely something that we're pushing for. There you go, Melissa. Thanks. I didn't realize Melissa Annes was here from the foundation. So in the chat, she says, by the end of 2020, hopefully, or probably. Definitely, and just, I'm not sure whoever asked the question, like, an 8 to 9 migration, there's no content migration involved. It's purely deprecation and just back end Drupal changes. There's you won't have to have a data migration or anything like that to go from 8 to 9. So it's incredibly low impact.
Thanks, Jordan. We have a couple other questions coming in. Awesome. So Lucas says we use mods heavily in our Islandora 7. We have lots of metadata fields that we use for search and display. How is that different in Islandora 8? And is mods XML stored, bracket in Fedora?
You want to field that, Jordan?
You can take the first crack.
Okay. I'll fall back as needed. So the way that in Islandora 8, the metadata is stored in fields on the Drupal nodes. And those are all indexed by Solr, made available for search and display. So that sort of takes care of the indexing question and how it's different. Now, there is no mod serialized in Fedora if you are using Fedora. If you do choose to use the community edition, I believe that may be an option. And I know that serializing formats is an option regardless of whether you use Fedora in the back end or whether you use some other option made available by Fly System. Did I get it?
Yeah, just to expand. So Lucas, the community edition, or like kind of like what core Islandora, if you want to call it that, is doing, has moved very much to RDF. So, you know, like on the Drupal end, fields are stored as just straight up fields in Drupal, and then they're mapped or serialized to Fedora as RDF, I believe. So you don't necessarily have a mods XML data stream that's readily available anymore. Similarly, it's not like you're editing XML directly anymore if you were to going to update that object. Yeah, and Stephen kind of touched on the search and display. So we're using the search API module in Drupal that handles the indexing and mapping and all that for you. So if you have another follow-up to that, I guess just ask another question. We can maybe expand on a little bit more.
Oh, I was just on mute. I feel like that's the best used phrase of 2020. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Lucas, for the question. Lucas, if you have any further, if we didn't cover it off appropriately, feel free to reach out afterwards, and we can set up some time or go through a detailed response. Janice, next question. This presentation was about migrating I7 to I8. But this process would be the same, but would this process be the same if migrating from another platform, say Drupal 6?
Yeah, I can field this one too, Stephen. So with what we've done with our migration approach, it wouldn't necessarily be tied to, say, a Drupal version. It'd be tied to coming out of FC Repo 3, because we are parsing the Fedora Object XML is kind of like our basis to get things into Drupal 8. So it's not necessarily limited to or tied to a specific version of Islandora. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Stephen?
Yeah, actually, procedurally, yes. So the technical aspect, obviously, if you have a specific source platform, in this case, I7, there are going to be parts of the process that are unique to that with respect to the tools. But procedurally, the outline that I've given you is something that could be adapted to other migrations. And actually, I did invite some people that weren't coming from 7 just for that reason.
Good. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Jordan. And thank you, Janice. So we don't have any further live questions. We'll give folks another minute or two if there's anything else you're curious about. Happy to answer it live. Feel free to submit any additional questions. While you think about that, as I mentioned, we do hope to host webinars on a probably a monthly basis is what we'll target, and so stay tuned for an upcoming topic next month. And then I'll also say that you're welcome to submit areas of interest that you'd like us to dive into in future webinars. There should be a survey that comes out after this wraps up, and so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. It doesn't look like we do have another question. Thank you. What, in your opinion, is the advantage of Islandora 8 over similar projects like Archipelago?
Archipelago. Yeah. Stephen, you want to answer this first, and I'll follow up.
Actually, I wouldn't, because I don't feel prepared with enough in-depth knowledge of the differences between the platform to cover those points.
Well, this answer will be 100% my opinion, so don't take it as the stock TGI answer, because like Stephen mentioned, Archipelago, for those of you who aren't familiar, is an offshoot by a former community member of the Islandora 7 community, to kind of do his approach of modeling content with Drupal and Fedora. Actually, I don't believe he's using Fedora anymore, but essentially they're both using Drupal 8 as their backbone. It's very similar in some sense, where I believe the last time I looked at Archipelago, they're using Fly System. The big difference, as far as I understand, is that, you know, the source XML, or kind of like your source metadata, is being stored as one glob of JSON in a field. And I can't say that I understand that design choice. I haven't really talked to Diego about his project since he, you know, moved away. Maybe Melissa might have some, you know, additional information, and or you could reach out to the foundation. But top of my head, I can't really say like what the main differs or why you might go to one versus the other. Architecturally, from a systems perspective, they're very similar in the sense that, with kind of, as far as I understand at least, with Archipelago and with what we've kind of gone to, we're not super reliant on Fedora on the back end, and we're very much utilizing Islandora as a framework, where Archipelago has kind of decided to, you know, do something similar, but just to forego Islandora proper.
Wearing my consultant hat, I'd like to contribute to that just a little bit. So, as someone with, you know, about 22 years doing small to medium scale IT projects, one of the things that I take very carefully into consideration is the size of the user base. And for me, I would say that the Islandora user base represents a much larger community, and is much larger to fall back on, and certainly that you know, that will ease the load of maintenance and ensure continuity. There's less risk.
Thanks, Stephen. Melissa, just to add, wrote in the chat, my understanding, which is thin, is that you can't use Drupal contrib off the shelf, but I don't know a lot. So thank you, Melissa, for adding. Okay, Lucas writes, will this presentation be available afterwards online, and if so, where? So the answer is yes. I think historically we have posted webinar recordings on our YouTube channel, but to make it simple for everyone, I'll shoot you the recording directly to all those who attended, and we likely will post the recording on our social channels as well. Michael writes, understanding that Islandora 8 utilizes an RDF-based model, is there support for various Islandora supported XML-based schemas such as mods, MADs, and TEI? Possibly RDF XML versions of those schemas. Our present Islandora 7 platform uses both mods and maps. Thanks. Jordan and or Stephen.
You want to take the first part of that as far as the modeling, Jordan, and then I'll follow up on the metadata schemas.
Sure, I can try. So I guess the short answer is no, in the sense that, like, your data is modeled very much at the Drupal level as just kind of fields on a normal Drupal entity. And that's kind of how they're stored. And that's kind of what I would say, if you want to talk about like source of truth for the metadata, that's where it's going to live in 8. However, like we did kind of mention on this call, and just actually going back to Archipelago and drawing a similarity there, you know, the idea being that while your data is stored that way, you can kind of write like what Drupal calls serializers, but to give a comparison, I guess we could call it, say, like a style sheet approach of you like transforming those fields into something meaningful, whether it be like, mods XML or mads XML or TEI or what have you. You do have the opportunity to do that and expose them that way. The kind of example that I gave previously in the presentation of, say, the JSON LD, that's kind of how that's done, where it takes kind of like the list of the fields, stored as entities, and then kind of serialize it that way. Similarly, I believe that is kind of what Islandora does when it does its kind of Fedora integration, where it's serializing those Drupal fields to be kind of the RDF representation, and then when it pushes it out to Fedora.
All right, I'll tag on the back of that. I get to wear two hats for this one. Thanks, Michael. Great question. So speaking first to the mods and mads, so doing the mapping of those to the Drupal field-based storage, that's something that we already have experience doing. So as needed, the repository content type can be made very capable to store mods data. And as far as the mads, yeah, I've actually already started using, I use taxonomies to represent these kinds of structures. So it's, again, the taxonomies are another type of structure. I'm the product manager for the institutional repository version, which means that we need to store profiles for scholars. And we very much, use fields that are off of the MAD schema to structure that taxonomy. So those two schema can be mapped in just fine. Now TEI, switching to my documentary editor hat, is it's an encoded text format. And then for people on that may be on board that don't know what TEI is, that stands for Text Encoding Initiative. This is a digital humanities metadata standard for the markup of textual documents. And it can be quite complex. As far as Islandora 8 is concerned, TEI would be stored as a media, what we call a media attached to a node. So, if you're thinking in Islandora 7 terms, you're looking at the manuscript solution pack. Well, I've got a data stream for, perhaps I'm using mods. Then I've got a data stream where I'm storing the TEI. Well, the TEI would map to a file attachment. I don't know if anybody has done any integration of a TEI viewer yet, but certainly that is possible within the Islandora 8 environment. So that is roughly how those three schema would come over. Let me know if that answers it for you.
Thanks, Stephen. And thanks, Jordan, for taking the first part of that question. Michael has a follow-up question. I'm interested in how validation routines can be performed to ensure that the objects conform particular schemas to ensure data validity and integrity. So the object could be potentially serialized from JSON LD to an XML representation and then checked for conformance to a particular XML schema.
Yep, I mean, that would pretty much be a workflow you could do. I could totally see a scenario where, like, the example I always think of that we've run into a few times is institutions that use like external authority record checks, where they export all their data in whatever format. They have that external service kind of verify it and they get them back. So, the intent with, this idea of serializers is that you are, mapping your Drupal fields to whatever, output format you want, and being able to, take that output and do what you want with it, whether it's to serve it up as a download for your end user or for your administration staff or whoever. But, you could also, I can foresee a scenario where you're doing that and then, validating it against an XSD or so on and so forth.
I want to tag just a little bit on the back of that. This is slightly off topic, but there are some pretty exciting features that already exist and some things that we're working on related to this now. So the setup, the mapping of fields within Drupal to controlled subject vocabularies, whether they're locally or being accessed by web service, is really, really good and really easy to implement. So there are a lot of ways that you can assure validity of the data that's being ingested if you're doing ingest through the in the UI. Now, speaking to opportunities for ingesting data outside of the UI, we've begun doing some work with a service called Flatfile that has a tremendous service for doing validation on large amounts of data. So if you're doing batch ingest, this is a tool I would recommend for people to look into to do validity checks before they get data in. For me, quality comes first. You should be focusing on the quality of the data going in, as well as being able to have the ability to run validations periodically.
Yeah, and I'll just expand on that a little bit more too. So, um, Drupal 8 and just the Islandora 8 approach in general allows, utilizing taxonomies or what Drupal would call entity references a whole lot easier um, during creating an object, in the sense that if you're saying this field has to point to whether it's a LOC subject or like a user in Drupal or whatever it might be, you can enforce that those things either exist or create a new one if it doesn't. And at that point, you no longer really have soft links in your metadata, and they're straight up hard links to actual entities or to actual vocabulary terms or whatever, which is miles ahead of what you would have to do in the old system to support that. And it also kind of eases or prevents an avenue to have that kind of metadata drift that unfortunately, does occur quite frequently when you're trying to say maybe you have an internal set of metadata standards or guidelines that says we conform with the LOC subject vocabulary. But if you're not doing that lookup or enforcing it off of a taxonomy as you're entering that data, it doesn't take much to either fat finger in a typo or to have a student enter it incorrectly, and so on and so forth. And very quickly, the kind of quality of your metadata degrades really fast.
And I want to tag on again, because maybe one of the big value adds of making the migration to I8 is to get those links into the data. If you choose to use the approach of moving some things to many things to taxonomy, then you can insert those hard links and get rid of those text values as a part of the migration process and get rid of that problem on your way over.
Great.
So yeah, with the follow-up question, not to step over you, Lauren. Yeah, I'd say if you want us a quick yes or no answer to that, no, because Islandora or Drupal, like out of the box right now, doesn't have the concept of external schemas. It's kind of like your data is here in Drupal as fields in a database, and that's it. Anything beyond that or expanding that to do validation at time of ingest would be a new undertaking. But I would say your kind of I don't want to say concerns, but questions around this and wondering about like XML serialization, you're definitely not the first person, and it's come up quite a bit, and it's pretty high on our priority list to support something like this, I would say. And you can back me up there, Stephen, I think.
Yeah, I'd actually be curious, Michael, if you could send in I also suspect that if we had a more in-depth discussion than what our time allows for today, to see the actual, the kind of the real world use case of this, there may already be a solution for it. May or may not, but it would be interesting to look at. Thank you for the provoking questions. It's great.
Yeah, really great.
In a good way.
We are 2 minutes to the hour. I think we've answered all questions, all 11 questions, great, that have come in. If there are, we have, do we have time?
Yeah, sure, okay. Yeah. I don't think there's been load testing in a sense, Lucas, and I think you would be getting into deviations depending on the approach you'd be taking with like your server architecture, for example. So like if you were still going to be using Fedora in the backend, I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that question. If David Wilcox is on the call, he might be able to answer that question, but I'm not sure where they're at with their state of load testing. On the Drupal end, in terms of just like pure amounts of entities, that would be pretty much database tuning. Beyond that, obviously, just to go to the bigger server architecture question, like what Stephen mentioned, with how things are split out, with everything being microserviced, you could see, scenarios where you would maybe need somewhat of a robust architecture, but overall, the kind of like architecture requirements is much less than what Islandora 7 was. I'd say if you're looking for like a top end bound of like a yes no kind of amount, I can't give you one, but it would be very very high because we're not really constrained out of the box by a triple store or like constrained by how Fedora is serializing things in a Kubra or anything like that, where it's just rows in a database table and databases scale really really nicely, and you can choose your flavor of database with Drupal, whether it's Postgres or MySQL or if you want to go more experimental than that, you could, I guess, but those are the two big ones that Drupal supports.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Actually, Stephen, I'll turn it over to you to close. I think that's it for today.
Oh man, just thank you, Lauren. Thanks, Jordan, for coming along. It was a pleasure to, as always, to work with you to do this. And thanks everybody for coming today. We really appreciate your interest. Thank you for all the questions, and thank you for any follow-ups you've sent. If something comes to mind after you're reviewing the presentation, oh, I forgot to ask this, just send it on to us. We'll be happy to get back to you. And as always, I value your time. Thank you very much.
And one last thing I'll say too is, if you have further questions, it's possible to connect with the Islandora community in the Islandora Slack or in the Google groups, and people from our company and other greater members of the community are around. You can try to help answer your questions there as well.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and you'll receive a recording and follow-up from me after. Take care. Bye.